Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar where we're going to be discussing what we've learned about adopting database DevOps and what we want to avoid. Just before we get started, running through a couple of housekeeping items. All attendees are on mute during this webinar, but we want to hear questions, so please, if you have any during the course of the presentation, just enter into the question box down in the corner and we'll make sure we leave some time at the end of the webinar to go through them. We're also recording the webinar, so we'll follow up with a copy of the recording as well as the slide over the next couple of days as well. As I said, panel debate, what we've learned about adopting database DevOps and what to avoid. On our panel today, we're rejoined by Kendra, who's obviously our Redgate evangelist, speaker, MVP, and founder of SQL Workbooks. We're also joined by William Durkin, who is the founder of SQL Grilling, MVP, and co-founder at Data Masterminds. And then for a guest judge today, we've got Tony Maddonna, who is our Microsoft Platform Lead and SQL Enterprise Architect at BMW. So thank you so much for joining us, everybody, and a special thanks to Tony for taking the time to join us as well. So also on the call was myself, James King. I'm one of the Enterprise Account Managers at Redgate Software. I'm taking your job there, Tony. Same format as before, everybody. What we want to do is get all these guys together to talk about their experiences in the real world with regards to the database. So we've got a number of questions here. First one we're going to start with is how do people deal with the increasing logistics of the amount of data they're looking after? So obviously, girls, we're looking at large amounts of data. It's growing rapidly. You know, it's becoming quite a big thing to deal with. And obviously, in the past we had things like compression natively in Microsoft, but you know we've got TDE also coming into this, which is affecting compression. How is everyone dealing with this?
That's a great question. And so this one, it's amazing how it's exploding. I mean, I remember back when 2 terabytes seemed like a lot of data. 2 terabytes doesn't seem like a lot of data anymore, right? Like the amount of data that you can collect now has, and collect easily, has become so massive. And one of the interesting things too is I think, years ago, back when 2 terabytes did seem like a lot of data, even back then, there wasn't a lot of purging of data that went on, right? Databases seem to just get larger. We never seem to actually have a way to archive out that old info because for whatever reason, people still want to report on it. And also it's just never a high priority to remove data for customers who are no longer with us. Somehow a lot of these tasks, like we don't develop good ways to do it in our code base because that's just not a feature a lot of people care about. We may talk about that more if we talk about compliance, right? But it is interesting because this problem of production growing gets larger and larger. And of course, to have production like data in dev environments, now that issue gets better. So I guess one question is, what do you guys think about in terms of these increasing amounts of data? Do we need to how many environments should we have production-sized data in? Should we have it in every single dev environment, or should we limit it? Like in a DevOps world, how many copies of this data do we need? And for the moment, I guess we should assume that we've properly masked and anonymized it in other environments. But that's a big choice.
Yeah, completely true. It's such a difficult topic, especially for me. I'm working as a consultant and an advisor for so many companies to decide how to even approach this. The whole hot thing of DevOps, and everybody should be taking production similar data because, like you say, everybody's masking their data, of course. And you're saying like 2 terabytes is no longer a large amount of data, but now we're also trying to do development where each developer has their own copy of the database. So you're taking production times the number of developers, times the number of environments that you have, so that even relatively small amounts of data, hundreds of gigabytes, all of a sudden turns into terabytes, where budgets have never been there for that reason. Where you're saying, well, your SAN was 5 terabytes a few years ago, and that was going to be enough for the rest of the universe. And all of a sudden we're saying, no, let's do this DevOps and CI/CD, and you need copies of production, the type data in development and in testing, and deal with that. So yeah, it's something that yeah, I'm not really answering the question, I guess, but it's something that I wrestle with every single day. How to do this, and also, like you mentioned, purging data. It's like, well, I actually this week had discussions with a client whose third-party software company refuses to allow them to purge data. So then we just throw the GDPR bomb at them, and they just went, "Oh my God," and ran away. So they're thinking about this, but it's interesting to see. Then there's like patient data in a system, which is then what are you going to do with that? So yeah, actually, I'm really looking forward, hopefully, to hear from Tony, BMW Group. That sounds like that's going to be some pretty cool environment. I'm really interested to hear what you've got to say about this.
Yeah, this is a hurdle for us, and it unfortunately has come up exponentially overnight in some cases. Terabyte databases for us are pretty the norm for at least the past, I would say, 5 years. But fundamentally, we've sort of skipped right over petabyte. We're right into the exabyte world and broaching on, even considering zettabytes for, what's next. And, with the conception of big data, data lakes, and in a manufacturing environment, when you have, multiple types of widget, in our case, a car, with tens of thousands of itemized parts that all get documented and have to be tracked to the nth degree, and add other institutional components on there, like our financial services group and things like that. Well, we do not purge data very often. We have levels of data, meaning, obviously hot, warm, cold, archival. But it really is a philosophical change on how you handle A, the data set, and then B, the movement of the data set. I think storage of data is kind of easy, right? We can always put it in some place and have it and grow the storage accommodated. But getting it from A to B is the bigger problem. When you have a 24-hour shop and you have a, let's say, 10 terabyte database, which is in our world kind of small in the scheme of things, what happens if you have a DR scenario and you have to do a restore? You're talking about logistically hours of downtime, minimal. So there's so many facets to it. And it was kind of funny. I was out at PASS just a couple of weeks ago in Seattle, and I was in another group, and a gentleman made the statement of, well, now we're in the cloud, we really only need one copy of your data. And I sort of got up and left that conversation, and I was like, well, and then I sort of had to place my thoughts, and then came back around to him and said, well, how do you handle the potential of data corruption? Let's not even talk about data loss or point in time restore recovery for any type of logistic component that may come up, whether that be from a legislative body that has an audit or some other reason to go and pick a needle out of a haystack. And he looked at me and goes, well, one copy of your data should always be sufficient. And I said, never in a million years. And you get back to, again, the development world. How many environments do you have? How many DevOps groups do you have? How many DevOps groups that are cross-compliant? So you not only have a single copy of your data that washes across the group that controls it, but you have that copy of data that also breaches into your master data set and into your big data set and into your data lake and across other areas. So it is a challenge. And again, the biggest hurdle ends up usually being cost and infrastructure. So there isn't a good answer outside of snapshotting things these days. To use the word backup and restore seems kind of innate at this point in time, because again, how would you back up a 10 terabyte database and restore it in a situation where you really have a, let's say, 24/7 5 sigma environment? We won't even talk about 6 sigma. So it's a challenge, and it really is a costly challenge. And for us, we keep approaching it by adding storage and growing capacity. And essentially, thankfully, storage costs have come down significantly to be able to compensate for it. But for us, the bigger challenge is how do we move the data around to the point where we can do data refreshes out of production, mask it, and then put it into a non-production environment to do analysis on it. And then the next step of the conversation is analytics and BI, which then takes this data set, scrubs it, creates a new data set, and people go crazy. So it's going to be very interesting. It's definitely a hurdle. And James was over not too long ago. We were talking about this, and one of the biggest issues with us is encryption, because we've made a conformed effort to increase security and deploy a lot of encryption. And once you get encryption, you don't have compression. And once you don't have compression, well, it trickles down. So
yeah.
No answer, but again, long dissertation to say, yeah, we're all in the same boat here.
I think there are some ways I've learned to make it easier just by sort of looking back at some of the things that were times that my team did sort of get stuck and sort of do it wrong. So we had one environment I worked with, we had large databases, and we wanted staging to be as close to production as we could have it to be, so that when changes got deployed through staging, we had more of an idea of how it was going to perform in production. We had more leeway for other environments to be a little bit more out of sync. And this was important because we had a lot of transactional replication and different relationships between these large databases in the environment. So not all of that replication would be set up in everyone's dev sandbox, for instance. The problem that we really had was we were always really super slow to refresh the staging environment. We had no data masking in it whatsoever. And things would happen, it could be normal in that staging environment for job runtime, like these long processing jobs, to run 6, 8 hours, maybe 12 hours. Looking back on it, I think tools like Redgate SQL provision would have helped us a lot in terms of being able to populate other environments to be similar sizes. But we also needed to make an essential change in breaking down the ownership of that staging environment, because it was owned entirely by the DBA team. If we had said, hey, guess what? We are going to add monitoring to this environment, and we're going to let the dev teams also own it. But if you break it, your changes are getting stuck. But just so that teams could know as they're deploying into that environment, they would have a way to know what is normal, is something blocked, did we slow something down? If we had treated that environment more like a critical environment, because it is critical to releasing changes, and we had actually shared ownership of it, I think we could have, because it became this point, it was so big and so easy to slow down, the data sets were so large in there that it became this big blocker for changes to be able to release to production. And it led to these long change lag times of oh, you wrote this code 30 days ago, and yeah, we deploy code every day, but it's been more than a month since you wrote this code to when it actually hits production, because it's getting bottled up in the staging environment because of the size. So I think tools and people changes were needed to help deal with the increasing amounts of data, because just having the DBA team own that staging environment, it wasn't sufficient. Now, we also would have needed to automate more things like drift reports between staging and production, just so we would know, hey, we've got a lot of people touching this. Is it still in line where we think it is? So we really we needed a lot more of those DevOps concepts to make things move faster, looking back. And, this was early enough. We didn't even have the term DevOps back then, of the case I'm thinking of. So lots of lessons, I think.
You mentioned the DevOps there.
And that's a very valid.
Oh, sorry, Tony. I was just going to say, you obviously mentioned the DevOps there, and just to come back to that, I think it's probably a good time to move on to the next slide, because actually, this emphasis back towards people, we talk about shift left, shifting the emphasis back on people and what they do with their data and how they deal with it. DevOps, where do you begin with this sort of stuff? We talk about standardization, we talk about automation, we talk about monitoring, but, Tony, what about your experience of this? You must be drawn into this whole DevOps stuff on a regular basis. It must be a buzzword around for you.
Yeah, it is a significant mantra, if you will, these days. It's DevOps and Agile. It's kind of funny. Every time somebody says Agile to me, I just look back at them and say blockchain. I was like, we just trading the term of the day kind of thing. But it's very unique in our environment too, because our IT group is not really a development house. However, we are. we've got a large amount of custom applications that front end a lot of our customer interfaces, especially web-based, and mobility products that come out that allow you to take the experience of the car with you and tie it all together with your mobile lifestyle. So it was more of a shift in, you know, do we draw the line and still keep it sort of segregated between the development guys and the operation guys? And in some cases, we have to do that mostly from a legalistic perspective. But in other cases, you know, can the development guys actually just roll right through and actually take operational ownership of smaller components of it and free the true operational guys out for the bigger picture? And that's generally how we've proceeded. Each group does it autonomously to themselves. At the SQL level here, since we operate globally and operate SQL through all of our entities in all countries, we're a little bit more segregated because we have to have unique responsibilities with operational insight into, again, a lot of legal issues that reside in China, for example, as opposed to Germany. You know, Germany has the Workmen's Council that is very unique to there, that doesn't cross the pond to us here in the States. So it's all about team, and it's all about communication, right? So the key to it is making sure everybody and every role and responsibility is well identified. Everybody knows their role within the team, and everybody steps up and executes. The days of micromanagement are gone. You know, so if I can't rely on the person to take his responsibility and run with it and assume that he can then in turn hand off appropriately, then the whole supply chain breaks essentially for DevOps. So the key is really make sure that your people and your skill set are appropriately honed, and then the tools that you give them to collaborate and corroborate all the information that they glean are actually effective for what they're using. You know, big companies like ourselves tend to make decisions globally, and sometimes a lot of it is focused out of Munich for us, but occasionally somebody in Asia Pacific will come up with a product and they start using a product, and then Germany's using the standard, and now one guy's on page 1 and the other guy's on page 36, and there's no way of communicating or connecting the two together. So as long as your tool set is right and your teaming is right, then you should be successful, provided, again, the staffing and the knowledge base exists.
I mean, I guess it must be quite hard to sort of make sure everyone's on the same page when you've got such a global team. But I mean, you know, how do you deal with that sort of stuff? Does it come back at you?
Oh yes, daily. And you know, being the oversight, that really the hardest logistic issue is time, right? We have so many time zones that we're operating in to be able to coordinate those efforts. And, you know, I've got guys that, you know, start working at 8 p.m. Eastern time and, you know, clock out at 4 a.m. and everybody else gets into the office, and you say, well, where's he? Well, he's had a all-nighter with the Asia region, because we do operate everything out of the United States in this particular case. But, you know, when you get global, it gets a little bit more difficult because, again, there's a lot of planning and communication, again, making sure everybody knows who's doing what and what are the coverages. When you can focus on smaller entities or groups that are at least regionally placed as opposed to globally placed, it tends to be a little bit more practical. But again, communicate, and make sure that there's tools like GoToMeeting, like Microsoft Link or Teams these days, are all in place for everybody to have access to and actually be able to get their ideas around. Because, you know, the biggest problem is in the DevOps world, if you have that good idea and it doesn't end up propagating itself, then you don't move.
Sure. And I guess, like William, you know, to you go into a lot of places, a lot of different size companies on a regular basis. I mean, if you're going in and they're saying, look, we need to implement DevOps, you know, what's your opinion? Where do they begin? Where do they start with this sort of stuff?
Yeah, it's quite similar to like Tony said, obviously not on a global scale. If I'm working with a company only in Germany or only in Holland or whatever, then you don't have that difficulty of communication cross-border or time zone. But it's certainly a case of making sure that people understand what it is you're trying to do, because DevOps isn't a final goal, right? It's a continuous process. So you're not going to actually say in 6 months we have our DevOps, even though maybe managers think that maybe is the case, right? It's got to be, it's a change in the way that you're going to do the work. And I'm definitely a proponent of the idea of ignore the tech to begin with and think about the process. Basically, the tech should be there to facilitate the process. So whether you want to take the cool stuff from Redgate or you want to take it from company X, doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. It's more of how can you ensure that the dev team and the ops team. It's nice that the DevOps itself has now become two words stuck together, rather than with a slash between it, or I can't even remember the English word, the minus sign, hyphen. There we go. There's no separation of dev and ops, right? They should be together, and that's the whole point. There shouldn't be a gatekeepy thing from the ops team, and there shouldn't be a we hate the ops team from the dev team. It should be working together, and that's something that I really tried in previous jobs when I was a full-time employee, trying to reduce that or remove that barrier to actually work together. And as soon as those barriers get removed, and you do have to have your legal separation of duties and all these sorts of things, but that's what automation is for. The tooling can take care of that. As soon as that is then agreed upon, then you can implement the tools to make that happen. And that's where I spend a lot of my time, is explaining what is a DevOps and how can you achieve that in a company? How can it actually help a company? Some companies don't need a full-on development pipeline and things like that, but I throw any automation into the mix of what I see as DevOps. So whether that's automating a restore from production into dev with the necessary data cleansing, or whether that's just starting up and stopping VMs on a day, or whatever, like anything to smooth the process and make my life as a previous DBA much easier. I don't want to be working on tickets all the time. I want to do real work. So it's automate everything. This is why the whole PowerShell thing and DBA tools and all these extra tools that you can buy and use are fantastic to free up and let me do valuable work for the business rather than working tickets.
Yeah, I've gotten to sit in on some customer calls lately, which has been extremely enlightening and really fun. And one of the questions that's come up a lot, so at Redgate, we have 4 parts that we describe DevOps in, which I think is a really useful construct, whether or not you use Redgate tools or not. There's standardize, there's automate, there's monitor, and there's protect. And before we automate, we really have to standardize, but it's a really difficult thing when it comes to the database, especially a lot of people don't have the database and version control. So we literally start at standardizing and saying, okay, we need to understand what's in our environment. We need to get things into source control, and people get stuck. And one question that comes up a lot is, I feel like I need to fix everything before I get my database into source control. You know, we've got these stored procedures that refer to tables that don't exist anymore. We've got all this mess in our database that we just haven't taken care of. And just get it standardized. Just if you have to filter some of this stuff out from your source control because it's just crap, that's fine. Just get the important stuff into source control. Like at the beginning of your project, just standardize. That will be worth it no matter what you do afterwards. But yeah, there is this impulse we have of but before I start on my new plan, I need to get in shape first. Yeah, no, you're never gonna be done getting into shape. Get the standardization done and then iterate on improving, because we're never gonna be perfectly ready to start. No, just start where you are.
Just get started. Take the first step. I mean, even the big companies, Microsoft and so on, who develop software for the last 30, 40 years, right? They're not perfect. And it's just, like you say, get the first start going. Like if you mention unit testing to some development teams, they're like, oh my God, then we've got to write unit tests for everything. No, write one unit test. Then you write a second unit test, and you keep going until you then get code coverage. It's this whole, I guess that's why I say you never actually achieve our DevOps. You're going to have to implement the process and slowly tidy up.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a reason that Agile methodology works well with it, because you have to be flexible, you have to be willing to make those mistakes, and you have to be willing to just lay it out there and not be so concerned, is it perfect? Because again, I'm going to fall back to Six Sigma. If you can achieve Six Sigma in developing code, then you don't belong anywhere in our industry, because you're God from that perspective. It's just, if my philosophy personally is, if I can get to 90%, I'm happy. If I can get to 95%, that's the 5% that I have to fine tune and make pretty. The last 5%, I don't care, because it's not gonna work. It takes too much time and too much concentration of effort and resources and money to be able to try to make it perfect, which maybe you'll get really, really close, but you'll never get there. And by the time you spend all that time, resources, money, it's now obsolete. So be flexible, be the ability to change, and be willing to make the mistakes as you're going along, and just, again, have that process, and definitely have the standardization. So if you have to fall back somewhere, you always know what point you're starting from.
Yeah.
I like that a lot. Okay, because time's ticking, let's move on to the next one, because obviously with all this, I'm sure we've all had this. People are getting told, we need to get DevOps. The executives are saying, we need DevOps, we need to be agile. They're using the buzzwords, but then when it actually comes to the crunch of defining what that means and then trying to get them on board with that, I think a lot of people really tend to struggle. I think there's always a disparity between what the top's saying and what the bottom's saying, and you've got to do with that. So, I mean, how do you guys kind of get around this? I mean, how have you found you've dealt with this?
In the past, I've just taken a very small project and demonstrated the actual value of doing something like this. Takes a bit of courage, I guess. You've got to try and lean a bit out of the window and be like, okay, I'm going to go out on a limb here. I'm going to really try and prove the point. And being able to turn something around inside 2 weeks because you've followed this more agile approach and this more DevOpsy approach, just provides the proof that you need to actually, at least maybe your direct manager, or maybe like it says here, executive level, will accept that it's a useful thing. I mean, pretty much every manager magazine in IT circles now is all about agile and DevOps, and have been for the past couple of years. So they all are basically coming to you as a developer, probably quite often saying, I want a DevOps, make a DevOps for me. And that is almost automatic support from them to say, okay, well, we don't want to do a big bang. Like we said, how do you start? Where do you begin with DevOps? Then start with something small and just take iterations that way. That seems to be the best way to approach it on an executive level. A big bang always costs too much time, too much money. They're not interested in it. If you say, well, we've got to close the shop for a year so that we can set up everything to be perfect from A to Z, it's just not going to work. Nobody will do that. Not even the coolest startup is going to say, yeah, let's do the DevOps thing that way. They want fast iterations. So small chunks. How do you eat an elephant? One small bit at a time.
Oh, and there is this, there's like a DevOps programming game that's like Elephant Carpaccio, right? Where the training day is you take this set of big tasks and you challenge people to carve off the smallest slice of task possible. Elephant does seem like it would be disgusting as Carpaccio, but it's an amusing name. I think one important thing, so I've been listening to a lot of podcasts lately that are targeted towards executive level leadership, especially executives at larger companies. Things like Forrester has a great one that's a technology podcast, Harvard Business Review, Gartner, that kind of thing. And the interesting thing about listening to those and also listening to things like keynotes by Satya Nadella and other high-level CTOs is they very rarely say the word DevOps. The terminology that they use is a bit different, but it's very much aligned with DevOps. There's this concept of digital transformation now that really resonates in these high-level executive circles. And I think one thing that can be helpful, and I think this isn't just at the beginning of the project, I think as you're making improvements, translating things into this language is important. So we don't necessarily have to call things DevOps. We can talk, instead of saying, oh, we did this many releases, we want to talk about, okay, these are the pieces of value we delivered to the customer, and here is how long it took to deliver value to the customer. And we want to talk about things in more of a language that, like, time to market. Here's the time to market it took us to get this feature out, instead of talking more about our release tempo, our release cadence, or our build process. We want to learn to kind of shift the language around into business terms when talking with people who deal with business. And I think it just makes it more natural for them to understand, instead of, oh, you're using these tech acronyms and it's not that hard of a language to learn. So that's one of the tips I have, is to listen to a couple of these podcasts or look at cheat sheets like I'm building, and kind of learn this language to translate into that just is easier to understand for people who don't spend all their time, next to the build server.
Maybe we get some of those links from you for the follow-on from this, because they're quite interesting, I think, to people. But yeah, I think there's a lot to be said about trying to define what is the business objective, and how do you fit into that, and how does what you do fit into that, and the language that's going to be understood. So that's, good tips.
And really pay attention to your company's strategy. This is something I neglected for years. Pay attention to what your company's big goal is. And when you run into higher level people in the elevator, start up a conversation about that. Hey, I was reading in our, company strategy about X. What do you think about that, right? Like, align your conversations to your company strategy. It's not like a crazy thing to do, but it's something that I just neglected for years, and it's really important.
It's only going to help people as well, right, in their careers as well. So,
yeah.
And Tony, I mean, obviously you must deal with a lot of this sort of stuff, at a much bigger level than most. I mean, do you find that it's easy to relate what you're trying to do and what you're trying to get from management?
Actually, in our case, we've been quite lucky, because a lot of the initiative came from middle tier management, I would say, and escalated very quickly to upper management. And since we always look at being progressive, once they were able to relate to what other companies were doing, i.e. Google and Apple and other larger entities, it became less of a ubiquitous type of ether and more of a tangible that we can now say, yeah, this makes sense. So for us, the concept of DevOps and Agile was actually pretty easy from we want to adopt this perspective. Now, it was difficult from let's implement it, and how do we go about doing that, because there were a lot of opinions in that pool. And we're still rolling through the bumps, and honestly, our group, the Global SQL Operations Group, was the first true global DevOps group within our company. So, personally, from my perspective, I always sort of acted in a DevOps way, because, what's your alternatives? You go down, a total separation, and who in this day and age actually only wears one hat. So generally you had to do some development, especially as a DBA or any type of administration group. And then you definitely had to operate whatever the heck you created, because nobody else understood it, right? So at the end of the day, there was a sort of informal tone that was already set. And for us, it was just more of a switched mindset of going agile, as opposed to old methodologies like waterfall, which everybody seems to keep falling back to. We must do A, then B, then C, then D, as opposed to being able to sort of scattershot things. That was probably a little bit harder for people to understand and gravitate towards, mostly because of old habits are hard to break, as opposed to conceptually accepting the DevOps model. So now I'll be thankful for us that it really wasn't too terrible. And it's a long process, because we are a large company, so many subgroups. It's going to take years for us to actually have it permeate the entire organization and actually be very efficient and effective in the way we do it.
I really like what you mentioned earlier as well about just the observation that you need to be able to trust the practitioners. You need to be able to trust the people that are doing the work and empower them to make decisions and do the right thing. Do you feel like that culture was already in place, or has that changed and evolved along the journey you've taken with implementing DevOps?
In some cases, it was in place. It really depends on the group, and it also depends on one of the things that we didn't really talk. We talked about regionalization and globalization, time zones, and other things. One of the things is cultural. There's the cultural concept of how people look at things based on their geography and their background and education and whatnot also shifts how things get adopted and accepted. So, there were certain groups, my group going way back from the time, had to evolve. I have worked with other people that were very much has to be this way. And then me, I've always been one of those ones, let's try it. If it breaks, we're not going to kill anybody. We're not operating here. We can always fall back and adjust. And so I'd say it's 50-50. It really depends on the personality, the culture, everything else that comes along with it.
Mm-hmm.
Completely agree. I live in Germany. I'm from the UK, so I've got the double cultural appreciation in that respect. And I don't know how much Tony can back me up on this, with BMW being based in Germany and being based in Munich in Bavaria of all places, the most conservative part of Germany, in my opinion. It can be quite difficult to convince some people to accept newer tech. And one of the things that I hear quite often when trying to approach changing process or changing development styles or technology is we've always done it this way. And executive levels in quite a few of the companies that I've spoken to in Germany is very much traditional. We've always done it this way. So I can completely agree that this has a big cultural impact or aspect of how to approach these things as well. So something that works in the US or in the UK doesn't necessarily work in France or in Italy or in Germany or in Australia. There's a big a mindset that you sometimes have to completely break. So DevOps is definitely a thing. Cloud is definitely a thing. And basically those two go almost hand in hand, right? If you're going to approach a cloud project, then you're almost forced to go towards the DevOps and agile style of approach to make the project successful. And just getting those two things and knocking those out of the park, especially in Germany, in my experience in the past few years, it's been really, really difficult just speaking to those topics and for them to say that's a viable thing. It's like, no. We're doing a 2-year project and we're going to get the project plan out and we're going to plan every single week and it'll be a waterfall. And when there is a delay, we're going to push everything back. It's like, oh my word.
Yeah, and from a German perspective, dealing with everybody around the globe regularly, there are pockets, right? It really comes down to personality. It comes down to education. It comes down to age. I've been doing this for 30 plus years, but I still think of myself as being in college. So I embrace change. I embrace new things, and technology is still cool to me. As much as I hate computers sometimes, but technology is still cool to me. There's people that find their niche, and that's it. They just want to deal with their niche, and some of those people you can change, some of them you can't. The ones that you can't tend to evolve into different positions and move away from that particular new philosophical group. So at the end of the day, I think it all works its way out. It just takes a little bit longer.
Yep.
Yeah. So in a larger company, maybe identifying those leaders and executives who are more of the personality type or of the just sort of technical, they have that technical excitement, and
Sure.
Identifying champions maybe is the tactic to take there, since not everyone's gonna be on board. But I think that's actually normal. I mean, I've even had people from smaller companies in the United States who are doing DevOps ask me questions like, okay, we've got some of our executive team who are really excited about this, and then some other members who just don't get it. How do we convince them into it? So even in a smaller company, in the United States, this can absolutely happen, because you just have disagreement among people about what is the best way to do things. And we have to live with that friction and just figure out the best way to deal with it. Friction isn't necessarily bad. And this is an interesting thing that I think actually works in DevOps is not everybody has to agree about everything. The idea is just to do continuous improvement and to have strong communication. But difference of opinions and the ability for people to disagree with one another openly is actually a positive thing in your process, because you want to have people comfortable disagreeing with one another and saying, oh, I think there's a different way we could do this. So it's not always a bad thing. And it won't always stop you to not have everyone on board.
No, for sure. But like Tony mentioned, sort of attacking the should we say the problem at the mid-manager level can be really, really powerful. That's sort of the tack that I was trying to mention a bit earlier on, where I was saying try something out as a skunkworks type project. Just get something up and running, prove its viability, and then you have the next level above you trying to fight the fight for you. And it can spread quite quickly. I mean, I've seen it happen a few times in companies where we just tried things out. Like you said, find the champions inside the company, let them play a little bit, give them a little bit of breathing room so they can try these things out and just prove the day. Then you need to take the things that Kendra just mentioned as well, of translate it into management speak. Nobody cares about DevOps and releases and I don't know, DAC packs or whatever you want to talk about. The tech isn't important, it's what's it doing for the business. And as soon as you translate it into that, which is what the executive team needs, then even if there's some execs that are against it, they can't ignore the bottom line that comes out of it. If you're saving money and improving the company, then they can't say it's terrible.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, thanks guys on that. Let's move on to the last one, because I know this is a pretty hot topic, and to be honest, it kind of rolls in a little bit as well from the perspective of, you know, everything's evolving quicker. It's not just about are you evolving or not, it's about how quickly you can evolve. And you know, we've even seen this with Microsoft. The frequency of their releases increasing, you know, they're sort of messing with new technologies. Linux is obviously something that's come into the picture as well. I mean, how is this affecting you, you know, the day-to-day business, this increased speed of releases and trying to adapt what has been quite a monolith, I guess, in the past to this increased rate of change?
Tony, I know you're excited about some of the 2019 features, and I'm very interested to learn about why you're excited about it and just what your vision is of where that's going.
You know, it's kind of funny, and again, I'm going to date myself, but when back in even high school and college, I was a Unix guy. Unix, not Linux. Linux wasn't even around yet. And went into Novell and then went into Windows. And I was very much anti-Windows because it just ticked me off. It wasn't reliable, it wasn't stable. And then as
now you're the Microsoft platform lead.
Exactly, go figure. And then as Microsoft evolved and we saw the evolution, every product got a little bit better. And occasionally you had a stall, ME for the operating system or some Vista thing over here. But for the most part, they always put a better foot forward than the previous. Having been down to Ignite and at PASS and speaking with Bob Ward and some of the other key guys within the core of Microsoft's development side, what they've presented in 2019, both for SQL as well as for Windows Server, I think are game changers because of the synergy between the two products. You know, prior to this, you know, you had features that ran on Windows Server that were available in version A but not version B, and then you had version-specific things within SQL. It seems like for some reason the stars aligned within Redmond, and they figured out, well, wait a minute, if both groups talk to each other, and maybe this is an internal Microsoft DevOps agile thing, we'll be able to actually utilize the features and functions and benefits between both product offerings. So breaking, you know, what came around with 2012 for SQL and a lot of the evolutionary things with availability groups and high reliability and TDE and, you know, now with R services and JSON and other types of things, we're taking that initial sort of what I would call prototyping up until 2016 and now actually making it viable. So 2017, when they sort of threw that monkey wrench out and said, oh, big data, and let's talk about this. And then it looks like somebody took a step back and said, well, wait a minute, let's tie all these loose ends together. So looking at 2019 from the operating system and SQL, talking about internal and external product offerings like SQL on Linux, ties in with external interfaces like partnerships with Docker and partnerships with Kubernetes, and the ability to do containers, and tie this all in a unified concept where Microsoft is now playing in the sandbox as opposed to trying to own the sandbox themselves, I think has changed their approach. And it was refreshing for me. Last year at Ignite was very annoying because all we heard was cloud, 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 cloud. And everybody's like, oh, let's go to the cloud. That'll fix everything. Well, this year at Ignite, everybody's like hybrid. They finally came to the realization that I can't just pick up my 20 or 40 terabyte database and pop it into the cloud and the world will be great because I've got an ISDN connection there that is going to transfer my queries back and forth at some illustrious period of time. So with the hybridization and a lot of the scope changes for higher reliability with the SQL on Linux, with the platform integration components, I think this is going to be the first step in the synergy of product offerings for Microsoft. And it's the two core platform products that they have. SQL is their largest bread and butter winner from anything outside of the operating system from servers. And when you tie those two products together, then, we currently right now, Microsoft SQL Server within our organization has far surpassed any other database offering that we have. And we also use Oracle and other miscellaneous database environments. So I'm excited. Everything that I've seen on the pre-releases of SQL have been solid. They're not releasing things in a haphazard fashion. So the product feature set seems to work pretty stably. And we are a joint input for them, so we feed them a lot of data, and they've taken it with open arms as opposed to before where it sort of just was like, okay, and you got some lip service and it went off to the side. So I think it's going to be a very interesting time next year, 2020, when these sort of solutions come out and are actually implemented in a production environment. And then you get that hybridization of prem and off-prem, and everything sort of ties together. I think the world will be a little bit easier for all of us regarding both development and operations.
It is interesting watching the change in culture at Microsoft. So I worked at Microsoft for 5 years. It's been a long time. So I worked there for 5 years, many years ago, and it was a great company to work at. There were a lot of terrific things about it, but since leaving, and I still know a lot of folks who work there and interact with a lot of people, the culture really has changed there dramatically in the last few years. And I don't know how much of it within the data platform group, I don't know how much of it is just leadership transforming the way that people work together. It does seem like people really are much more empowered and to make decisions, to make changes. And then I don't know how much of it is now they run this cloud organization and they have to do DevOps all the time, right? They have to actually figure out and manage SQL Server as a service, and they're designing a lot of things around making that management easier. They're having more of a customer perspective. I don't know how much is each, but it does really seem like I'm constantly surprised and delighted by them these days, whereas before, I was always sort of hesitant when something cool was coming out. So I was like, well, it might just be a V1 and done. Right. Now I'm less suspicious of that now, and I'm more like, oh, this could be something that could really have legs and could go somewhere. I am shocked at people considering running SQL Server on Linux in production, just because that would have been so unthinkable a few years ago. But it really is getting to the point now where I'm like, oh yeah, I would absolutely consider running some of my dev environments on containers. And, I still probably want a production-like staging environment, but mixing operating systems underneath the SQL Server no longer seems like such a big deal, which is crazy to me.
Right, exactly. And the unified tool sets that they're putting together, they've consciously said, okay, we're going to make this tool set work across platforms. So it's browser based, and I don't care what's underneath the hood. And that makes a big difference.
Yeah. Yeah, there's talk of sysinternals building the sysinternals tools for Linux so that even people who are used to being system administrators on Windows and aren't used to managing Linux can have a similar tool set across platforms, which
Well,
to me, I think is super exciting.
It's already there with Azure Data Studio. So Azure Data Studio and SSMS 18X has seamless integration. So it's going to be interesting.
How about you, William? Are you looking at 2019 stuff?
Yeah, I've just been fighting with containers this week and Linux. So yeah, it's like you said, Kendra, there's things coming on board which 2 years ago, I would never have thought that that's going to happen. SQL on Linux are integrated into the engine, and Python and things. It's like, what? It's just crazy. It's so strange though, because I mean, tech goes fast all the time. It always has gone fast, but I just can't keep up. I know that I'm consciously ignoring sections of the data platform from Microsoft because I just cannot keep up. It's not possible. Before it was legitimate to say, okay, I mean, I've avoided analysis services and that corner of SQL Server since 2006. Had a really, really, really bad project, completely burnt out in 18 months. It was terrible. So I said, no SSAS ever again. So I felt that was a legitimate thing to do. And now at least I can say, well, I've got to ignore that because there's just so much going on there. The Power BI things, the R integration, all this stuff. I just can't do that. There's no way. The stuff I'm concentrating on is cloud and automation and stuff. That's more than enough to fill the rest of my life or something. I don't know. But this just means there is no longer what I would used to say is a SQL Server DBA or a Microsoft DBA. It's just not possible, right? It's going to be even more specialization in certain areas. We see that as well with I know I speak at lots of conferences, and there's people that I just know, okay, this topic A, B, C, I'll speak to these two people. D, E, F, there's three people over in that corner. And you just don't bother speaking to anybody about that topic except these specific people who've just said, that's it, this is my niche, this is what I'm going to do, and end of story. And there's no other way to do it. 2019 is just making it even more.
By the way, no.
Oh, you can change niches for sure.
I think this thing of being like sort of, some people describe it as T-shaped, some people do, other things, but the idea of, having a certain breadth of knowledge and then specializing in certain areas, like, is more and more attractive. Sure. I hope I'm allowed to say this. I had a great conversation with Ned Otter from the SQL Server community at SQL Saturday Portland, and we were chatting about in-memory OLTP because he had picked that as his niche for a while. When Hackathon first came out, he was, decided to kind of learn a lot about it. It was a great opportunity because there weren't a lot of experts at it, and he, became the in-memory OLTP person. Well, sometimes you pick a horse that doesn't win the popularity race, right? But now he's like, well, now I am, I'm seeing other topics. I've decided to be in an open relationship and specialize in other things just because at a certain point you need to change what your deep specialization is in. I don't think he has any regrets, but it was a really interesting conversation. And by the way, I don't want to say that in-memory OLTP is completely over for folks who weren't at PASS. There are interesting ways it's working itself into core areas of the product. But yeah, widespread adoption, it has not seen.
Sure. No, sure.
Well, not to interrupt, but I think that's going to change. I think with BI and SSAS, as much as I'm right there with you, I'm not a fan because it is complex. I think when you start looking at these analytic parts and the ability to not only analyze real-time data, but do it in such a way that it reacts in real time also, especially in a manufacturing environment like we are, it'll be back, and it'll be back with a vengeance as soon as memory prices drop and the server platform gets to the point where we start seeing 8, 10, 20 terabytes of RAM in a server.
Oh, for sure. I mean, this is the part, like Kendra says, you niche down, but your niche is not going to be the same forever. Mm-hmm. Anybody who was an expert in DTS back in SQL 2000 days, not really a cool niche anymore. So, yeah, all I was meaning is, yeah, you've got to have this bright. I do know that there is different tech in the Microsoft data platform. So if somebody came to me and said, we want to do some analytics, we want to get into big data, I can point them in the right direction. There's no way that I could build a big data cluster and make the things work for them, right? So yeah, I think like the T shape, or is it they're not T, but maybe multiple L shapes or something, lots of wide knowledge, and then some certain niches that you just specialize in, something that you like. That's going to be the way that you're going to manage to do these things. And the good thing is, there are so many niches just in the Microsoft platform that you can choose 5 or 6 and you can make a really good career off of that. It's not a problem at all.
Oh, this is why it's so important, even with your company, William. Obviously you've all got your own sort of strengths within it, and there's always someone you can call, which is why the community is so important too, right? You keep learning, got to keep going to events, networking. So if it's not you, someone who can.
That's it, exactly.
So I guess we're coming to the end of the hour. I mean, anyone out there got any questions for the team before we sign off for the day?
Yeah, we've still got a bunch of you in here. Ooh, there is a question. Look at that.
Oh, here we go. Yeah, so how do you manage teams working on the same database and the same procs, I guess? That's from David Rizzo.
That is a great question, David. What do you guys think?
You don't. It's my proc. Get off it. No.
It's about how big the proc is. I think that's the end. If it's a big one, you can sort of slice and dice it a little bit. But if it's a straightforward, we don't. We generally assign those particular specifics to individuals.
Yeah, I suppose that's almost too technical to dive right in and say how to split up the procs. I guess it's more like you wouldn't give the ownership of a certain stored procedure in a database to a certain dev until they leave the company. It's more on almost a ticket story, whatever you want to call it, basis, where it's okay, now we're going to change the way the business works, so we need to touch this stored procedure. Then I would assume that only one dev is going to be working on that stored procedure at any one time.
And if it is a large procedure, so depending on your strategy and how you're doing it, some people do use like a shared database system where there's like a locking when somebody's working on an object. But ideally, you're not doing that. Ideally, like William said, people have their own sandboxes, and you maybe have a branching strategy for when you're doing changes. Now, if multiple people are working on the same sprock, you're going to have issues when you merge that you're going to have to resolve. There's luckily a lot of memes out there that will help comfort you when this happens. Yesterday, I was doing a slide deck on this, and I just searched for merge conflict meme, and right, merging is painful. And if you have multiple people working on the same objects, you may have merge conflicts you have to resolve. But I don't think it's necessarily that hard. It may be harder if you're working with some static data in the table and you have data conflicts. But just when it comes to more of a schema and a programmability issue, I think you can get through those merging hurdles without it being too bad.
David's added to this as well. Sorry, just to cut in. We're having a debate right now as to whether we should put a SQL project in the same solution as our .NET project versus having one big GitLab repo, one big solution with all the databases in it. So I'd love to hear what you guys have got to say about that.
I can speak quickly because it's all under me, and we have .NET, IIS, SQL, everything under the same group. It works out pretty well. And the reason it works out pretty well, again, I want to fall back to the team construction and communication. My .NET programmers help my SQL guys out constantly with both Visual Studio, with other types of programming that certain guys don't use all the time and others do. A lot of PowerShell cross connects in there too. So it does fit nicely under the same umbrella, and it adds to both skill growth as well as team growth when those two entities merge. But again, you have to manage it.
Yeah, so I think there as well, I'd like to add that making sure that the process is set up correctly. I don't know what the size is of David's group, but effectively, if you are doing a DevOps, then you would have source control, you would have projects that belong to the source control and should be able to follow through and say, okay, we've got these developers, we've got these tickets that need processing, and the ownership of that using the source control would make that issue pretty much disappear. I mean, Kendra said merge conflicts. Yeah, okay, these things can happen, but that generally, to be honest, I've only really seen big merge conflicts where it's massively separate teams or developer groups, where they're physically different time zones, different locations, and so on. So if you're really lucky, David, and you're all in the same building, then the chance of merge conflicts is a lot lower. And of course, there's super cool tools from the company down in Cambridge that can also make your whole source control story and your development process a lot easier, to make sure you can find out what's going on. But pretty much any source control tool will be able to recognize when there is a conflict and how to deal with that.
Absolutely.
Guys, we're out of time. There was one more question here from David Towers, but I'll try and email you that one, David. Just quickly before we go as well, those that are interested, there is the SQL in the City streams coming up on December the 12th. It's our little plug. Kendra, I think you'll be speaking on that one again. Yeah. Along with Grant and Steve and anyone else doing that, you know?
Both of the Chris's?
Of course, both the Chris's. Yeah, everyone's going to be doing this. So be sure to check that out. Obviously, register and you can join. But just before we have to go, thank you so much, everyone. It really has been fantastic. As always, Tony, really appreciate your time. I know you're a busy guy, so I think it's been really useful.
Tony?
Loved it. I hope to do it again sometime. It was great to be with you guys.
I'm going to hold you to that.
you know you got my number.
All right, everybody, have a great day. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thanks. Merry Christmas.
Bye.